Do you know what's great? Dragons. And do you know what just got them? A Game of Thrones mod for Crusader Kings 3, a grand strategy game usually set in the real medieval period. But today we're not going to be playing on Earth. We will instead be exploring the lands of Westeros and beyond in George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire universe, through the mechanics of CK3, thanks to the amazing mod developers over there. And I decided to take my first foray into the dragonized version of this mod with myself, the mighty mage, mighty of the house Magery, and we will be arriving in some irrelevant corner of Essos, far away from the major players of the Game of Thrones TV show or books, but we will spread our house to glory, I am sure, because we are paired with the great dragon Emperor. That is his name. He came with us to this strange land, outsiders both, alien to the ways of these small people, led by a dynasty known as the Targaryens, dragon masters of their own right. We don't know anything about them, and they do not know our names, but hopefully that's about to change. Once I was into the realm proper, the first thing I needed to do was secure an alliance. I'm isolated, I'm alone, and we are vulnerable. I look around for whoever's offering, and the greatest alliance available is with the Lannisters, a big name on the land of Westeros. There was a small issue though. Their only spouse on offer was 30 years of age, and we were 18, which means that the window of getting a successful heir was actually quite short. But no matter how far I looked, there were no other worthwhile alliances. So I had a bit of a malicious scheme. We publicly accept this marriage so that we get the support of the Lannister might, but perhaps since we are over the sea, once the time is right, we divorce the spouse and forgo the alliance. That is perhaps not the Westerosi way, but we are not of Westeros. So, the wedding went through without a problem, we were married, and we have the Lannisters backing our cause. The next step was to look at some land to take control of and allow my dragon to demonstrate its power so that the locals know we mean business. However, on my way to set this up, one of my government assistants, my steward, began seducing mighty Magery. Now, this wasn't to my plans, but on further thought, it could be quite useful. We've just mentioned the issue of our spouse, who we intend to throw away anyway. If we could have a true loving relation with someone younger and still quite relevant to our political schemes, who's going to complain about that? So I allowed her to attempt to win over the heart of the mighty mage. Meanwhile, we began our draconic conquest of the lands just to my southern border. The battle seemed evenly matched at first. Both our armies were similar size with similar compositions of units, but the difference was I had a dragon, and we breathed hellfire across their ranks, tearing them down in no time flat. And once their army was quashed, we moved on to their castle. The keep was nothing to the spitballs of flame that we would launch over, and before long they were forced to capitulate to our demands. Their old ruler scattered to the winds as a nobody wanderer. Meanwhile, one of the new territories I annexed from them was completely loyal to me from the get-go, halving the amount of effort I would need to do to control the new subjects. In this moment of victory, I decided to celebrate by legalizing slavery. We rounded up all of the survivors loyal to my old enemy and put them in chains for my own profit. It might be a dark deed, but we're on to a quest to usurp an entire kingdom, and some stones, I'm afraid, will have to be unturned. In the lull of war, I decided to focus more to managing my domain, spending coin to build new facilities. We expanded some of my economic buildings, and we would also try and build a slavers camp so that we could store excess slaves to make our profit margins higher. During this peaceful period, our first child was born to the Lannister wife, and thus became our heir. However, again, the mother of our daughter is not someone we care too much about, and so whilst waiting for certain things to finish, my character looked around to see if there was anyone worth winning his affections, and a really strong woman was found wandering around the lands with no master or duty to serve. So he began sending her letters and meeting her discreetly, and eventually the two fell in love and she was invited to court. Around the same time, the person who was seducing our character, if you remember this is the steward, completed her romance scheme when a thief tried to stab the mighty mage and she stabbed him first. So back to back, two blasphemous relationships were forged beneath the nose of his wife. What could go wrong? It didn't take long for things to go wrong. Almost immediately, the woman that our character was seducing, the strong person, ended up becoming pregnant with his child, and she announced to the world that the father was in fact Mighty of House Majory. This gave us a negative stigma with people that didn't like adultery, including the spouse and her family. At this point in time, I was still thinking, well, it's fine, we were going to throw her away, who cares if she doesn't like me? This couldn't have any repercussions in the future, could it? So that proceeded as you would expect, with the child being born healthily, and unfortunately, due to the announcement, it was an illegitimate son of House Majory, though we would press on. I decided to take a look at what the Targaryen dynasty was up to across the sea, and I found out that Daemon had actually lost his war for the Stepstones against the pirates and had to return to his brother king, presumably in a lot of shame. Since in the canon he wins this, it was an interesting turn of events. But it wasn't as interesting, or perhaps as impactful, as what was about to happen next. There I was, minding my business, planning my plans, how to get rid of my wife, and then suddenly a plague pops up. But not just any plague, the spring sickness, akin to the Black Death of real-world history. This was terrible news, because our family was still small, unprotected, and all the children were young, so we could get completely wiped out and game over right here, our legacy done before the world even learnt of us. I looked where it started, far away in Westeros, but how long would that last? Unfortunately, not long enough. It spread ridiculously quick, all the way down to the Stepstones that Daemon had lost, crossing them to reach Essos, and then crawling up towards my local area. All of the time in between then, I was panicking, trying to build as many plague counteractives as I could. I told my maester to work on counteracting the plague. My dragon burnt fields to clear land for development, and I was desperately trying to scrounge up enough gold to build a hospice in time. Alas, by the time the plague had reached my borders, I did not have enough funds to construct that hospice. So instead we did the next best thing. We locked everything down. Curfew was in order. Everyone stay in your homes. And the capital, the castle, I locked the doors and kept my family inside at the expense of some of my loyal servants.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
Although I didn't get to close the gate immediately, we did isolate the capital, but as for my family hiding in the keep, I had to strategically wait in time with the most unfortunate timing of a pregnancy, because now this is a bit annoying, you can't quickly add newborns to your lockdown if they were born after you did it, and I've already experienced in the normal CK3 children just dying left and right as a result. It's very annoying. So I waited until they were born to lock it down, and thankfully it worked. What followed though was a year or two long period of waiting. I watched and read reports from locals who had dared venture outside their castle walls of how far and quickly the plague had spread. Almost all the known world was dying under its uncaring touch. I had more children born to the House of Majory at this time, and so my fears of infection had returned. But after the long wait, I would be graced with fortune. No deaths within the family. I did lose a very loyal and efficient spy master, as well as a couple of my knights, but none of my bloodline had perished or even contracted the illness, which was amazing. So the spring sickness had passed, and my lands were on the way to recover. With the gold I had saved, I managed to initiate a couple of laws and orders that would reinvigorate the landscape and restore the economy in good time. Our family, as I mentioned before, had expanded a lot during the lockdown, and the lover Xana, who was the strong woman that our character seduced, had become the favourite consort because she had given the most children, and the children really encapsulated the dark mage aspect of House Magery. With our lands on the recovery, and with a powerful dragon at my side, I looked to the large empire of Pentos, rulership of city-states, and realised most of their lands were in active rebellion, cutting down their army's forces. This was the perfect time to go for a land grab, and that's what I did. I started a war with Pentos to grab some land that isolated me from the sea and made me landlocked, but I was relying on the Lannister household to finally come through and come to my aid. However, when I went to call on their banners, the house head had folded his arms and said he didn't like me and he wasn't going to live up to our alliance. So it turns out that going behind our legal spouse's back did in fact come with a consequence. Though, a minor one, for we have a dragon. They can't beat us, numbers or no. And I was right. Our first clash with this new war was in victory. I saw an army of 4,000 rebellious members of the enemy's faction and left them fair enough alone. This meant that my actual army had to fight a small percentage of Pentos's force, and I thought we could secure it quickly by going after one of their hill-hold capitals without waiting for the next clash of arms. This proved to be a fatal error. I climbed the hill. The castle walls gleamed in the sun and began to wax away as my dragon's flame bore down upon them all. And then I caught the spring sickness. How? How did I catch it? I waited it out in my castle walls. None of the family got close to it. And yet now, during my victory, I get it? Turns out that hill, that single hill, had the last dying strain of the plague right there. And by going over there to try and hasten my victory, I put myself in contact with it, even though it was on the way out. My body was deteriorating, the hair was falling out, blood weak. But I have the blood of the dragon. I can win this. I can... I died. The death of Mighty was a huge wrench in my overall plans, you might imagine. Not ever had I accounted for the idea that a plague that was almost extinct would take him out in the span of about 30 days. He went from king of the world to dead. His daughter Terra would inherit the kingdom. The war would end and we wouldn't gain any land, even though should Mighty have lived, we most certainly were going to win. A bunch of our councillors had a lessened opinion of us, and most importantly of all, the Dragon Emperor was now wild. We had no place for it to stay. It was flying around, eating sheep, burning people that came too close. Terra wanted that dragon. That was the symbol of House Magery's power. And now, without a house head, it was most important of all to maintain that image. But she was about 9 or 8 years old. There's not much she could do. So, unfortunately, we had to bide our time and wait. Half House Magery, half House Lannister. She was able to reach out to her relative back in Westeros and re-establish the alliance between the Lannisters and the House of Magery. Hopefully this time they will actually help me out. But we weren't going to sit around and wait. Age or no, our character needed to get the dragon back. So she began a scheme to try and bond with it, singing its songs of the old Dragonland Valyria, visiting it with food. But the dragon was not having it. Sure, he served her father as a companion, but this is an unproven little girl who does not deserve the scales on his back. And he made it known, because at the end of her attempts, the dragon unleashed flame against a blood member of House Majory, burning Terra's skin visibly forever. Scarred, our princess of fashion wasn't deterred and looked frantically for a way to get the dragon on her side. She even started requesting reports of other wild, untamed dragons be brought to her, figuring out perhaps if there was another way to reclaim dragon ascendancy. She may not have known this, but for every generation from now on that went without a dragon, our connection to dragon blood would fade until we were no longer compatible. So there really was a pressure to get the dragon back. This passion, this desire, this drive would be the undoing of Terra Majory. She would spend her life focused on researching dragons and trying to bond with them. Even upon her adulthood, one of the first things she would do is return to the Emperor Dragon to bond with it. This time, he allowed her to place her hands on his snout, and she had thought she'd done it. But then its jaws opened wide and snapped shut. Terra, the Princess of Fashion of House Majory, died at a very young age to the dragon that her father once rode, and thus the inheritance passed down to the once illegitimate but then restored member of the house, Blazon, born to Zana, the favoured consort of Mighty of House Majory, was now the ruler of the house. And unfortunately, he was in the middle of a slave rebellion. His forces were able to sweep up the rebellion, and thankfully we were able to resell the rebellion members back into slavery, getting us some of those profits back and teaching them a lesson once and for all. More importantly, Blazon had just witnessed his sister's demise at their father's dragon's claws. He wanted the dragons as well, but he was not as brave or as fierce as his deceased sister. In fact, you could call him somewhat of a craven. He was goaded into trying to bond with Emperor, but he received a nasty slash, and although he recovered safe and sound, that cemented the idea in his mind that perhaps following his sister's path of getting burnt and dying wasn't the way to do this. So even more so than his sister, he studied the dragons. He brought in maesters and historians to tell him about their lineage, where they came from, and where they currently roam. Emperor, for example, seems to have made his permanent lair somewhere in Majory's lands, which meant that despite the fact they weren't able to control him, he should always remain somewhat nearby. There were other dragons, like Vhagar, one of the three dragons led by the Targaryen's ancestral leader Aegon the Conqueror to capture Westeros, was still alive and untamed. There was another one called Cannibal, and as its name suggests, it makes its survival by eating other dragons. Both of these sounded incredibly intimidating for young Blazon, so he thought of a new idea. The dragons are still plentiful because House Targaryen is breeding them, and if they're breeding them, it means they have a lot of eggs, and unlike perhaps his father's dragon Emperor, an egg will lead to a small little hatchling that's impressionable and far less likely to burn your face off than an adult dragon. So what if he could dedicate himself to figuring out how to steal dragon eggs from the Targaryens? This began his newest scheme. He'll bide his time, improve his skills, forge alliances if he must, but he'll get his hands on a dragon egg and make it his own. But then an opportunity came to his ear. He was alerted that the dragon rider of Meleys, the Red Queen, had perished, and her dragon was roaming free. So he made a gambit. He would try and bond with this dragon. And so is the tale of House Majory. They began with such promise, but now, after a series of unfortunate tragedies, find themselves in a precarious situation. It could go in any direction. Maybe they will hold the dragon once more, maybe the dragon blood will leave them, or maybe they'll become extinct entirely. The real questions will remain, because that is where I decided to leave my playthrough. But I am more than willing to continue going forward. Please tell me your thoughts of this series. It's something I've not really done too much of in the past, but if you enjoy the story, I'll be more than happy to continue it. Until next time, this has been the Mighty Mage, signing off.